So our next presenter is Jake Jeffers. Jake Jeffers first got interested in brewing as a biochemistry major when he was in college, and he's been a member of the Lawrence Brewers Guild for 8 years and a home brewer for over 20 years. And he'll be showing us how to brew our first batch at home here today. So we'll give Jake a moment to get set up.
Thanks, and thanks for having the Brewers Guild back to the How To Festival. So like most folks, we had to adapt this year. So the plan is to share some video. It gives a pretty basic overview of brewing for those just getting into the hobby. Unfortunately, we're not able to cover everything that we want to, but if you have questions, we'll do a Q&A at the end, and we have some panelists here that can help answer those questions. So we'll get right into the video.
Jake, I think you need to share your computer sound.
Sorry about that. Let's try that again.
Hey everyone, my name is Jake Jeffers, and on behalf of the Lawrence Brewers Guild, welcome to homebrewing. Homebrewing is an incredibly fun hobby that's a wonderful balance of art and science. You can get started with some fairly basic equipment in your kitchen and grow as much as you want until your garage is completely taken over. Today I'll talk about some of the basics of brewing and show you how to make your first batch of beer. We'll talk about the ingredients, the process, what you'll need to get started. For your first batch, I recommend buying an ingredient kit from your local homebrew shop. These have usually been tested and reliable starting points. Here are a few of the basic ingredients that you might find in a kit. But first, we have malt. Malt is the soul of beer. It adds loads of flavor, but also adds sugar, most of which the yeast will convert to alcohol and carbon dioxide. So what is malt? Malt is made from grains like barley and wheat by steeping them in water until they're nearly sprouting. This process develops the enzymes needed for the next step, which is mashing. As you can see, there's a wide variety, each adding its own character. Your kit may contain some malt to be used as steeping grains. These are specialty grains that can be used without mashing to add specific flavors and color. Your kit will also contain liquid or dry malt extract. Looks like this. This is malt that has already been mashed. The resulting liquid, called wort, is concentrated into this form, allowing you, the brewer, to skip the mashing step. Note this comes in its own varieties that add different flavors and colors. Next we have hops. These are the cone-shaped flowers of the hop plant. The two most common varieties you'll find are whole and pelletized hops. So hops add bitterness, which will balance the residual sweetness of the malt. They can also add a wide variety of citrus, spicy, floral flavors to your beer. We also have water, which is by weight the main ingredient in beer, but it generally isn't contributing as much flavor as the other ingredients. That said, I recommend using carbon filtered tap water if you have that available. Better yet, use RO water or reverse osmosis water. This can be purchased from your local grocery store. Next we have adjuncts, fruits, vegetables, spices. Your kit may include a number of flavorings or sugars that can add complexity or simply add more fermentable sugar. This will just add more alcohol content. This will be your opportunity to get creative, experiment, and have fun with it. Maybe you want to add jalapenos or Milky Way bars or make a maple bacon beer. Go for it, have fun. Although I would use caution, adding bacon directly to your beer is not as exciting as it sounds. We also have nutrients and clarifying agents. Nutrients are not typically included with your kit, but are worth mentioning because they can lead to improved yeast health. Irish moss or whirlfloc is sometimes added at the end of the boil to improve clarity. Now finally, I've saved the best for last. Yeast is easily the most important ingredient in beer. Yeast is a magical microscopic organism that converts sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's available in many varieties that have been collected from breweries all over the world. Each variety has been cultivated by a brewery or series of breweries over hundreds of years, developing its unique characteristics suited for the style it's used in. So each time you add yeast to your wort, think of the history and the genetic journey the strain has made to get to your beer. I highly recommend you stick with ale yeast starting out because it generally ferments closer to room temperature. Your kit will probably include dry yeast, but liquid yeast is also available. Yeast health is extremely important. It is dependent on a number of factors, so pay close attention when we cover this later. So that's a fair overview of ingredients. Let's get brewing. So the first step in the brewing process will be cleaning and sanitizing your equipment. This is an incredibly important step to ensure the only thing growing in your beer is your yeast. Now, if you've purchased a starter brewing kit, which is a great way to get the equipment that you need to get started, you'll have a primary and secondary fermenter. Plastic is okay to use for fermentation. Just know that over time, it'll get scratched from cleaning and harbor unwanted microbes. This means that eventually you'll need to replace it. Now, your starter equipment kit will probably come with a one-step cleanser. While this will work fine to get you started, I recommend a cleaning regimen that includes 2 steps, an alkaline cleanser like PBW and a sanitizer like Star San or iodophor. Just follow the instructions on the packaging. Now I'll be using this glass carboy as my primary fermenter today. As you can see, it's clean and still has Star San in it. We'll pour this out right before I use it. Now be sure to clean and sanitize anything that will touch your beer after the boil, like tubing, airlock, and auto siphon. One piece of equipment that won't be included in your starter kit is the boil kettle. Now I recommend the biggest size that you're comfortable picking up and moving while it's full and using on your stove. This one is stainless steel and it's 22 quarts. It has a thicker layered bottom that's good for using on electric stovetops. And so this is what you'll need to get started. Let's start heating up some water. So the recipe I'm making today is a fairly basic pale ale. Now I've got all my ingredients staged here and ready to go. I've filled my kettle with just a few inches at the top to leave room for the boil. Now it's important to remember, if you're making a 5-gallon batch, you'll need some fresh water at the end to top up to your finished volume. This recipe requires some steeping grains. So we're heating this water to about 160 degrees, and then we're going to steep them for about 15 minutes before we move on to the next step. Let's take a closer look. So my water has reached about 160 degrees. So we're ready to add the steeping grains. And we're going to let that go for about 15 minutes. So I'm going to start a timer. Now while we're waiting for that to steep, notice that I've got my liquid malt extract here in some water heating up. This will make it much easier to incorporate later on. So it's been 15 minutes. And as you can see, we've steeped the grains and picked up quite a bit of color. So now we're going to pull them out and let them drain back into the kettle. Now I can turn my temperature back up until we hit boiling, and then we'll be ready to add the malt extract. So I've got a little bit of a boil going, and I've turned the heat off. And it's important that we turn the heat off before we add the extract so that we don't scorch it on the bottom of the pan. So to help with that, I'm going to pour this in and stir very slowly. Now once this is fully mixed in, we can turn the heat back up. So now our extract is fully mixed in, and we've returned to a boil. Now it's really important to be careful not to let this boil over. You'll want to watch it closely, adjusting the heat and stirring frequently. This is especially important when we add hops. Now your recipe will tell you when to add hops and how long to boil them. Again, be very, very careful. This will lead to a boil over if you have your heat too high. So once in, we'll start a timer for the amount of time that we need to boil these hops. In this case, my first hop addition is for 30 minutes, and I won't have another until the end. So if you're adding Whirlfloc or Irish Moss, this will go in with about 10 minutes left in the boil. So I'm now going to add my hops. We're going to give that a little bit of a stir. They will have a tendency to collect on the side of your kettle. Now I'm going to start a timer. So I've boiled for 30 minutes. I added my Whirlfloc, and now I'm going to turn the heat off and add the last of my hops, and also a little bit of honey. The honey is going to increase the alcohol content and make a beer that finishes just a little bit drier. So here's the last of my hops. I want to stir those in. We're going to stir this for about 5 minutes. This is called the whirlpool. And then next, I'll carry it over to the sink where I've filled it with some water and ice to cool the wort quickly to our fermentation temperature. This will also allow everything to settle out, the solids, so we don't carry this over to our fermenter. So now we're at the chilling step. This may take a little while depending on the volume of wort, ice, and water. It should cool in about half an hour or so. If needed, drain the water and add fresh water and ice. Be careful from here on because the wort is now most vulnerable to contamination from unwanted microbes. Once the wort has been chilled down to your target temperature listed in your recipe, we can transfer it to a clean, sanitized fermenter. Remember, if you're going to make a 5-gallon batch and you need water to top up, you can chill that water to get a few more degrees closer to your fermentation temperature. Now that we've hit our starting temperature, we can transfer it to a clean carboy. If you still need to bring your wort up to a final volume, wait to measure your gravity until then. Use a sample thief to pull a sample and measure the specific gravity. Specific gravity, or density of the beer, equates to the sugar content. It should be close to what your recipe calls for. We'll want to transfer this carefully using the racking cane. So I've brought my wort up to the final volume, which in this case is 3 gallons. I've hit my starting temperature and my starting gravity. So it's time to pitch yeast. Remember, yeast health is very important. One thing yeast needs initially is oxygen. The wort has been stripped of dissolved oxygen during the boil, so you'll need to shake or stir the fermenter for 10 to 15 minutes to reintroduce oxygen. You can also buy a small bottle of oxygen and bubble it into the wort for a minute or so. Just remember good sanitation practices. You can add the dry yeast directly to your wort, or if you want to give the yeast a little head start, you can rehydrate it in warm water. About 10 mils per gram of yeast at 95 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Let it rest for about 15 minutes, and then gently stir till it's fully mixed. So I'm going to add the yeast directly to the wort, and then we'll wait. So here we have primary fermentation. It's been about 48 hours at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, out of the way of sunlight. And we have nice, healthy fermentation. In about 1 to 3 days, you'll see the airlock bubbling begin to slow. This generally indicates that fermentation is slow. Now here's a tip. Around this time, give the fermenter a vigorous swirl periodically to remove CO2 and resuspend the yeast. This will help make sure the yeast finishes, because unfinished or stuck fermentation will lead to a beer that's a little too sweet. After about 5 to 7 days of fermentation, you can transfer to a clean, sanitized secondary fermenter. While this isn't required, in my experience for new brewers, it leads to more complete fermentation and clearer beer. At any point, you can pull another sample and measure the gravity again. As sugars are converted to alcohol, the density gets lower. The recipe will list a finishing gravity. This will be your target. After about 2 weeks, your beer should be fully fermented and dropped clear. So it's been 2 weeks, and now we're ready to bottle. Be sure to carefully clean and sanitize everything, as always, including your bottles, tubing, bottling wand, auto siphon, and your bottling bucket. So I've dissolved the priming sugar, which should have been included in your ingredient kit, in a small amount of hot water, and added it to my bottling bucket first. Then transferred the clear beer, trying to avoid splashing and trying to avoid picking up any sediment in the process. Be sure the priming sugar is well mixed by stirring up with a sanitized spoon or your siphon. Just be careful to limit air exposure as much as possible. And now to bottle, you're going to connect the bottling wand to the tubing and then to the spigot on your bottling bucket. When you insert this into the bottle, the valve opens when it hits the bottom of the bottle, allowing it to fill. You'll want to cap each bottle right away with sanitized caps. Once this is capped and ready to go, it'll take about 14 days at room temperature for the yeast to convert the added sugar to CO2. And with no place to go, that CO2 will produce carbonated finished beer. This is called bottle conditioning. Now, depending on your temperature, it may take a little bit longer. So after 14 days, I recommend opening one of your bottles. You'll probably want to chill it first, and then see if it's sufficiently carbonated. If it's a little flat and has some sweetness, give it another week at room temperature. Now, once it's carved up and ready to go, cold age your bottles for at least a week. And that'll let the beer mature and the yeast settle out. And when it's finished, you'll finally be able to enjoy your very own fresh craft beer. Just be sure when you pour it out to decant off the sediment at the bottom of the bottle. Thanks for watching. I sure hope you enjoy homebrew as much as I do. Cheers.
Okay, thank you so very much. That was really wonderful and very informative. So I am ready for questions. If anybody has any, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. My question is, I heard you mention a maple bacon beer. Is that something you've actually tried, and how did it go?
Um, well, it was, yes, it was. And I tried a couple different methods, and I have to say that it didn't work very well. You have to be prepared as a brewer to sometimes you experiment and it just doesn't work out. The majority of that beer, unfortunately, went down the drain. But I actually tried a sort of what is a sort of a flavoring, and that wasn't very good. That was the final one that I've actually scaled up and tried to make, and that didn't end up so great. But I actually tried to extract some bacon flavor using vodka. Unfortunately, that extracted some oils, which will just kill the head retention of a beer. And there's something just really creepy about a beer that has no foam on it, even if it tastes good. So, yeah, failed experiment, but hey, I learned something.
Yes, just bacon, I guess, is just okay on its own.
I would recommend eating the bacon and then drinking the beer.
Brilliant. So we have a question. What temperature do you ferment at?
So that can vary by the type of yeast that you use. So generally speaking, the yeast that you have that comes with your kit will give a temperature range it works ideally at. Now, what will happen is that you'll probably want to pick a cooler room in your house. So depending on what your temperature is in your house or in your basement, you may not have a lot of control over that. So ale yeast will do pretty well around 70 degrees. Depending on the strain, you may want something higher, up to 73, 74 for Belgian ales. And probably below that for anything that you don't want to develop a lot of yeast character. So these can be like fruity esters that will have a distinct taste to it. So if you want a cleaner fermentation, ferment at a lower temperature. Now the caveat to that is that if you ferment down around 64 degrees, which some ale yeasts do pretty well at, you may need to pitch more yeast because that's going to work slower at a lower temperature. So that gets into a little bit more advanced brewing, but I say pick a cool room in your house, something 70 or just below. Most ale yeast will do pretty well there.
Great. So we've got another comment saying agreeing with me, this was fantastic. Seems like it's kind of a steep learning curve. How long have you been brewing, and how did your early experiments go? And I will ask that of anybody who wants to answer.
Frank, you wanna share there?
Let's see. I started homebrewing in 2008 or so. Early experiments are always rough. So like Jake recommended, I started with a kit. As a matter of fact, the homebrew shop I bought my equipment from threw in an ingredient kit for free. And that really helps. Really helps get you through the learning curve of the process and the ingredients and whatnot. Experiments are hit or miss. Like I've tried a lot of, my wife likes like chili beers, like jalapeno flavors and serrano chili flavors. I've experimented that all kinds of different ways, and it's really hard to hit it right. But that's the great thing about homebrewing is you can just try it. You don't have to worry about what you can find at the local store to drink. You can play around with stuff. But experiments are always learning curves. The worst case scenario, you have to dump something. The best case scenario is you made something you didn't intend on making, and it turned out pretty good.
Yeah, that's a great point, Frank. I love it when an experiment turns out fantastic. That's probably one of the best parts of homebrewing for me.
I'll jump in here too. And Lee Keck here. I've been brewing since 2014, and I actually joined the Lawrence Brewers Guild about the same time I started brewing. And so I didn't know what kind of equipment I wanted to invest in or anything like that. I went to some Lawrence Brewers Guild meetings, met people, went over to their house for a brew day, and kind of got to see how different people do it. Because, I mean, you've got the basic process, but there are variations you can make to that. So I did that for the first few years that I was brewing. I just brewed with other people, and then I'd take the beer home to ferment. And you can find us on the internet, lawrencebrewers.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And if you're, testing out your first home brew at home and have some questions, you can certainly leave them on the page and someone will answer them.
Excellent. I've got a few new questions. So does adding fruit to the beer increase the alcohol content?
Yeah, generally it will. So anything with sugar in it is, most sugars, and most fruit has fermentable sugar in it. And the yeast is just going to convert that into alcohol. Now, the interesting thing when you use fruit, it can be a challenge because you will often get flavors that you don't expect. Because when you eat fruit, you often are associating that sweetness with that fruit flavor. So what's left over after the sugars fermented out can be very different. And some fruits, you just have to add a ton to get the flavor, like strawberries. It's almost difficult to use too many strawberries if you're trying to brew with them.
Good to know. And so we've got another question. Are there adjustments that you need to make to the process if you have a gas or induction stove rather than an electric stove?
Actually, gas is a really great way to brew. In fact, as you start to scale up, you will probably at some point graduate to what is essentially like a turkey fryer burner, and that provides great, consistent, even heat. Induction's also a really good way. Just make sure that obviously whatever brew kettle you are using is compatible with an induction heating element.
Okay, and got another process question. So they said, I noticed when you added your yeast, you used liquid yeast. Does this work better than dry? They've only used dry.
So that's a good point. I didn't maybe say that specifically. I rehydrated a dry yeast. So I highly recommend rehydrating your dry yeast. It gives it a head start. And so the idea is that when you add that to your beer, you have the most healthy yeast cells, the largest number of healthy yeast cells in there to get started that you can. And so rehydrating helps improve their chances. As far as dry yeast versus liquid yeast, that's can be a big debate. I think that there's benefits to both. Actually, recently, I've been brewing more with dry yeast, and I found it's pretty successful.
That's interesting. Okay, so Lee mentioned that you guys are on Facebook, I believe, and then you've got your website. Someone is asking how they can learn more if you give lessons. Are there other places where you kind of do these how-tos?
Well, we meet monthly, although recently we've been doing it virtually instead of in person. But we have a YouTube page where we've been streaming our monthly meetings. So our past couple meetings are still up there. I believe we had a seminar on yeast in May, and then last week in June I did one on the malting process. You feel free to leave questions on our Facebook page. There's a lot of brewers with lots of years of knowledge. We like answering questions and helping people get started. Certainly when we start to meet in person again, that's kind of a better just conversationally to bring up questions. But yeah, we're here for support.
Great. And as we're bringing this out, we've got one last question. Does the amount of carbonation in the beer alter the flavor?
The easiest answer to that is yes, absolutely. There's different styles that call for different levels of carbonation. And what will generally happen, the main impact it'll have is if you overcarbonate a beer, it might have what we call a carbonic bite. It generates carbonic acid in the beer, and so that can have a little sharpness to it. Now, like I said, certain styles, that works well with. So generally, the kit will tell you how much sugar to add, and that really controls the carbonation level.
This is wonderful. I've got more questions that I will definitely hit you guys up on Facebook. And I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you so much, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day and have a good beer in the process.